The floor of the medical bay was too clean. That was Duncan's first thought as he sat on the examination table, gripping his upper arm where blood oozed between his fingers. The wound wasn't life-threatening, but it was deep, and the alien medics surrounding him were acting like he was on the verge of death. "Human, Duncan, remain still." The lead medic, a towering blue-skinned being named Valtir, pressed a scanner to his arm. His 4 eyes twitched in rapid succession. "You are hemorrhaging at an alarming rate." Duncan winced as the scanner beeped. "Yeah, I noticed. Can I just get a Band-Aid?" The room fell into stunned silence. The trainees, a group of younger aliens in pale green uniforms, exchanged wide-eyed glances. One of them, a shorter, copper-colored alien named Rel, gulped audibly. "A Band-Aid?" Rel's voice wavered. "Human Duncan, you require immediate tissue repair. Your epidermis has been severely lacerated." Duncan sighed. "It's not that bad." His fingers were sticky with blood, but he'd had worse. The cut was the result of a malfunctioning maintenance panel that had snapped closed as he was working, sending a jagged shard of metal straight into his arm. It stung, but he'd been expecting worse when he first saw the gash. Valtir's 4 eyes narrowed. "You are actively losing blood." "Yeah, that happens." The trainees gasped. One actually took a step back. Duncan frowned. "You guys do know humans can survive blood loss, right?" Rel made a distressed noise. "But, listen, just clean it up, slap something on it, and I'll be on my way." Valtir's gaze darkened. He turned to the trainees. "Prepare the suturing equipment. This wound is far beyond adhesive patches." Duncan groaned. "Stitches? Come on, it's not that big." Valtir ignored him. "Human Duncan, your species possesses a reckless disregard for bodily harm." Duncan shrugged with his uninjured arm. "We don't have the luxury of growing limbs back or regenerating tissue overnight. We just deal with it." Rel made a strangled sound. "That is horrifying." Duncan waved his good hand. "Look, just—" He swayed slightly as a wave of dizziness hit him. Okay, maybe he had lost a bit more blood than he thought. Valtir caught the movement and immediately pressed him back onto the table. "You are going to remain still." Duncan was about to argue when another sharp pulse of lightheadedness hit. Maybe he should stop fighting this. The trainees scrambled to assist, bringing trays of sterile instruments while Valtir methodically cleaned the wound. Duncan gritted his teeth as an antiseptic burn shot up his arm. "You will require local anesthesia," Valtir said. Duncan shook his head. "Just do it." Rel nearly dropped the tray he was holding. You refuse pain relief?" "I've had stitches before. It's not worth the hassle." The entire room stared at him in horror. Valtir exhaled sharply. "You are truly the most baffling species I have ever encountered." Duncan flexed his fingers. "Yeah, we get that a lot." The first stitch went in. He clenched his jaw but didn't react otherwise. Rel looked like he might faint. Duncan sighed. It was going to be a long afternoon. The sutures pulled at Duncan's skin, a faint tug each time Valtir looped the thread through. He focused on the ceiling, letting the sterile scent of antiseptic keep him grounded. His fingers curled loosely by his side, the worst of the dizziness fading, now that the bleeding had stopped. Rel hovered nearby, fidgeting with a tray of instruments. Duncan could feel the alien's nervous energy radiating off him, like a coiled spring waiting to snap. "You are experiencing pain," Rel blurted. Duncan exhaled through his nose. "Yeah, that happens when you get stitches." Valtir barely paused his work. "You should have accepted anesthetic." "I didn't feel like waiting for it to kick in." Rel's frills quivered. "You prioritize efficiency over comfort?" Duncan shifted slightly, testing his arm. The stitches held. "Not always, but in this case, yeah." The trainees whispered amongst themselves, their voices hushed but urgent. Duncan caught a few words: reckless, unnerving, inexplicable. Valtir tied off the last suture and clipped the thread. "The wound is sealed. You will need to keep the area clean and limit strenuous activity." Duncan flexed his fingers. The movement pulled at the fresh stitches, but it wasn't anything he couldn't handle. "Got it." Rel looked horrified. You are already moving it? Duncan glanced at him. Why wouldn't I? Your flesh was just sewn shut. Yeah, but it's not like it's going to pop open if I move a little. Valtir made a low, thoughtful sound. Your species' pain tolerance is formidable. Duncan slid off the table, rolling his shoulder experimentally. We just deal with it. Rel watched him like he was about to collapse at any moment. You require rest. I'll rest when I'm tired. More horrified whispers from the trainees. Valtir peeled off his gloves and disposed of them. Do human injuries not require convalescence? Duncan shrugged. Depends on the injury. This isn't that bad. Rel looked at Valtir, as if hoping for confirmation that this was, in fact, a serious wound. Valtir merely studied Duncan with a contemplative expression. You will return if complications arise, Valtir said. Sure, Duncan said, though he doubted he'd need to. As he turned to leave, Rel hesitated before speaking again. Human Duncan. Does your species not fear bodily harm? Duncan paused, considering the question. We do, but we also have to keep going, even when we're hurt. Rel seemed to struggle with that answer, that is, deeply unsettling. Duncan grinned. Welcome to humanity. He stepped out of the medical bay, leaving behind a room full of bewildered aliens. The corridor outside the medical bay was quiet. The usual hum of ship activity muted this far from the core systems. Duncan rolled his shoulder, testing the stitches again. The skin pulled tight, a faint sting beneath the layer of synthetic sealant Valtir had applied. Manageable. He had barely taken 10 steps when a sharp, chittering sound echoed behind him. Turning, he spotted Rel scrambling to catch up, his copper-toned limbs moving with an urgency that suggested unfinished business. You are returning to duty immediately, Rel said, his frills compressing in what Duncan was beginning to recognize as unease. Duncan exhaled through his nose. I've got work to do. The injury is still fresh. And? Rel hesitated, his wide eyes darting to Duncan's arm. Your species lacks appropriate caution. Duncan resumed walking. We don't have time to sit around every time we get a scratch. Rel matched his pace, his steps quicker to keep up. That was not a scratch. The dermal layer was compromised and you lost a significant volume of blood. Duncan flexed his fingers. Yeah, and now I'm stitched up, so it's fine. There was a brief silence before Rel blurted, Your body is held together by thread. Duncan couldn't help but laugh. That's how stitches work. Rel's frills twitched violently. This is not an acceptable state to resume physical activity. Duncan lifted an eyebrow. What do you expect me to do, stay in bed for a week? That would be the logical course of action. Duncan shook his head. Not happening. They passed an intersection, and Duncan turned down the path leading toward engineering. Rel hesitated before following, his posture tight with barely concealed distress. You are disregarding medical protocol, Rel said. Duncan gave him a sideways glance. Whose protocol, yours or mine? Rel's mandibles clicked together. Your species should not be functioning under these conditions. Duncan sighed. We don't have the luxury of shutting down every time something hurts. Rel stopped walking. Duncan took a few more steps before realizing, then turned back. The alien's expression was difficult to read, but the tension in his posture made it clear he was struggling to process something. Duncan crossed his arms. What? Rel's voice was quieter this time. How often do humans endure injury without treatment? Duncan rubbed the back of his neck. Depends on the situation. Do you often continue working through pain? Duncan met his gaze. If something needs to be done, yeah. Rel's flattened, his fingers curling slightly. That is deeply unsettling. Duncan huffed out a breath. You already said that. Rel didn't move. Does your species not value self-preservation? Duncan's lips twitched. We do. We're just adaptable. Rel scrutinized him for a long moment before finally exhaling through his spiracles. I do not understand humans. Duncan grinned. You're not the first to say that. Rel hesitated before falling back into step beside him. He was still visibly uneasy, but he had stopped trying to convince Duncan to return to medical. That was progress. As they neared engineering, Duncan glanced at the alien beside him. "You sticking around?" Rel's frills twitched. "I wish to observe." Duncan smirked. "Suit yourself." He stepped into the workshop, Rel trailing behind, still watching him like he might collapse at any moment. The engineering bay buzzed with quiet efficiency, the faint hum of machinery underlying the steady rhythm of work. Duncan strode in, his boots clicking against the reinforced flooring as he made his way toward his workstation. Rel trailed behind, his copper-toned fingers twitching at his sides, his gaze darting to Duncan's freshly stitched arm with barely concealed apprehension. Duncan ignored him, grabbing a utility scanner from his station and powering it up. The maintenance panel that sliced him open earlier still needed repairs, and he wasn't about to leave a malfunctioning system unchecked. The last thing anyone needed was more unexpected equipment failures. Rel edged closer as Duncan adjusted the scanner's settings. "Your injury is not fully healed." Duncan barely glanced up. "It's not going to heal if I just sit around either." Rel's frills flicked in agitation. "The sutures are a temporary measure. The tissue is still compromised." Duncan rolled his shoulder, testing the range of motion. "It's holding together fine." Rel let out a low, clicking sound. "You are actively stressing the wound site." Duncan set the scanner down and exhaled through his nose. "Look, you ever get hurt before?" Rel stiffened. "Of course." "So what do you do?" Rel hesitated before answering. "Standard protocol dictates rest and regenerative treatment." Duncan nodded. "Yeah, well, humans don't regenerate, so we just keep going." Rel's mandibles clicked together, his posture rigid. "This is not an acceptable approach to bodily integrity." Duncan snorted. "And yet, here I am." Rel's frills trembled slightly, but he said nothing. Duncan tapped a few commands into the scanner and moved toward the malfunctioning panel. The jagged metal edge that had cut him was still protruding slightly. He crouched, inspecting the damage, then reached for his toolkit. Rel shifted uncomfortably. "You are using the injured limb." Duncan didn't pause. "It's my dominant hand." Rel stared. "That does not necessitate its use." Duncan twisted a screwdriver, loosening a fastener. "It kind of does." Rel made a frustrated noise. "You are prolonging the healing process." Duncan shot him a look. "I'll live." Rel was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he crouched beside Duncan, his copper-toned hands flexing. "You should allow me to assist." Duncan raised an eyebrow. "You know how to repair a power relay?" Rel straightened slightly. "I am unfamiliar with human engineering, but I can follow instructions." Duncan considered that. His arm did ache more than he wanted to admit, and letting Rel handle the more tedious parts wasn't the worst idea. He exhaled, then passed Rel the screwdriver. "All right, loosen those connectors first." Rel took the tool with careful precision, his frills shifting as he studied the components. He hesitated, then began working, his movements slow but deliberate. Duncan watched, nodding when Rel successfully detached the damaged section. "Not bad." Rel didn't respond immediately. His focus remained on the task, but there was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. Duncan leaned back against the wall, flexing his fingers to keep the stiffness at bay. "You always this worried about injuries?" Rel didn't look up. "Your species treats bodily harm with alarming indifference." Duncan tilted his head. "I wouldn't say indifference." Rel's frills twitched. "You resumed work minutes after receiving sutures." Duncan shrugged. "I've worked through worse." Rel paused. "Worse?" Duncan exhaled. "Yeah." Rel turned to face him fully. "Elaborate." Duncan hesitated. "You ever heard of frostbite?" Rel's mandibles clicked softly. "No." Duncan rolled his shoulder again, the stiffness settling deeper into the muscle. "Extreme cold can kill tissue. If it gets bad enough, parts of your body just stop working." Rel's frills flattened. "Your species is vulnerable to freezing?" Duncan nodded. But we survive it, sometimes, even with permanent damage. Rel's fingers tightened around the screwdriver. That is unsettling. Duncan laughed. You keep saying that. Rel didn't respond immediately. He turned back to the panel, adjusting a loose connector before speaking again. How did you recover? Duncan glanced at his arm, the fresh stitches a stark contrast against his skin. Same way I always do. Keep going. Rel was quiet for a long moment. Then, carefully, he tightened the last fastener and set the screwdriver down. Your species is incomprehensible. Duncan grinned. Yeah, we get that a lot. Rel studied him for another second before exhaling and stepping back. The repair is complete. Duncan pushed off the wall, testing the panel's stability before nodding. Good work. Rel's frills flicked, the tension in his posture easing slightly. You should still rest. Duncan picked up his tools. I probably won't. Rel's exasperated chittering followed him as he moved to the next task. Duncan rotated his shoulder as he stepped away from the repaired panel, feeling the tight pull of the sutures beneath his skin. The ache was settling into a dull throb, manageable but persistent. He flexed his fingers, testing for stiffness, then wiped his hands on a rag before tossing it onto his workstation. Rel remained nearby, his copper-toned hands clasped in front of him, studying Duncan with the same wary intensity as before. The alien's frills twitched in short, irregular bursts, a clear indication that whatever conclusions he had drawn from observing Duncan work had only left him with more questions. Duncan exhaled and leaned against the workbench. You're still staring. Rel's frills flattened slightly. I'm attempting to understand. Duncan arched an eyebrow. Understand what? Rel hesitated. How does your species function under such conditions? Duncan huffed a quiet laugh. You make it sound like I'm falling apart. Rel's mandibles clicked once. Your body is actively repairing damaged tissue while you exert yourself. Duncan shrugged. That's how healing works. Rel was silent for a moment, then he abruptly stepped forward and gestured toward Duncan's arm. Show me. Duncan blinked. Show you what? The sutures. I wish to see how your body responds to injury. Duncan narrowed his eyes. You just want to stare at my stitches? Rel inclined his head. Yes. Duncan sighed but rolled up his sleeve, revealing the neat line of black thread holding his skin together. A thin layer of sealant covered the area, keeping the wound protected. Rel leaned in slightly, his frills flicking as he studied the injury with the same level of scrutiny one might reserve for an unfamiliar piece of technology. Rel's fingers twitched. Your body binds itself together through external intervention, yet you continue functioning as if undisturbed. Duncan tilted his head. That's kind of the point of stitches. Rel glanced up. Does it not hinder your movement? Duncan moved his arm in a slow circle. Not really, it just pulls a little. Rel straightened, his mandibles pressing together in thought. This is highly inefficient. Duncan gave him a look. Compared to what? Rel's frills quivered. Other species possess regenerative capabilities that eliminate the need for such crude methods. Duncan rolled his sleeve back down. Well, we don't. We have to patch ourselves up and wait. Rel tilted his head slightly. This process is slow. Duncan crossed his arms, faster than letting it heal on its own. Rel's gaze lingered on Duncan's arm before he finally stepped back. Your species compensates for biological limitations with intervention. Duncan nodded. That's medicine for you. Rel was silent for a moment, then he exhaled through his spiracles. This is acceptable. Duncan raised an eyebrow. Acceptable? Rel's frills flicked once. Your methods are crude but functional. I will refrain from further objection. Duncan chuckled. Glad to have your approval. Rel's mandibles clicked softly. I will continue observing. Duncan shook his head but didn't argue. He rolled his shoulder one last time, then turned back to his workstation, already shifting his focus to the next task. Rel remained nearby, his posture still tense with lingering apprehension, but he no longer voiced his concerns. That, at least, was progress. Duncan smirked to himself. Maybe aliens would never fully understand humans, but they were trying, and that was enough.